All right, everybody. Welcome. My name is Tim Conway. I am the curriculum lead here for the ICS curriculum at the SANS Institute. And as you can see on this slide, we have two other people joining me that I have had the privilege of working with for, almost 26 years of my career in this space. But I'm going to let Chris Holmquist and Lou Folkert introduce themselves in a few minutes as we get to some slides that I'm going to turn this over to them. This is the first in a webinar series of 6 different webcasts that will each focus on a different element of kind of industrial control systems and cloud integration. And I say those things knowing that those are both very, very broad terms. And specifically, as we move beyond kind of this first webcast and into the remaining, it is going to dive deeper into the area of NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and the CIP standards, Critical Infrastructure Protection. So those two pieces, as we look to cloud and cloud adoption and what that means for electric utilities operating across North America that are subject to the NERC CIP standards. And along the way, we acknowledge in each one of these webcasts that what we're talking about and what we're addressing is important across all of North America, regardless of what sector you're in, because it's similar vendors, similar original equipment manufacturers, and each of the 16 critical infrastructure is kind of looking at their own sets of regulation and requirements. We also acknowledge that this is of importance around the globe, as every geography and every region is looking at what they should be doing to protect their critical infrastructure and the services that they provide. And many areas are starting to pursue their own regulations, and they are also faced with these similar challenges. So while you're hearing NERC and while you're hearing CIP, and you're thinking about kind of all of these areas across people, process, and technology where we're looking at industrial cloud integration, you may very well be looking at kind of the process side. You might be looking at the information or the data. You might be thinking about the devices or the access control or managed service providers and how that integrates in to your normal process across operations, across monitoring, across alerting. And in a lot of ways, what does it mean from a cybersecurity perspective? And then uniquely, what we are also going to address in this webinar series is what does it mean from a compliance perspective? When some of this data is now in the hands of another custodian and they are handling potentially some access control. What does it mean if some of your after the fact analytics or forecasting data sets and applications are elsewhere? They're not on on-prem servers anymore. They're not controlled within your space. You don't manage the physical security of those assets. And even further, if you start to look across, if you integrate cloud systems and cloud services and cloud applications into direct control of a process environment. What does that mean from a security perspective? What does it mean if it's unavailable? How do you build and engineer and architect a system that provides a similar level of reliability and resilience and security? As you think of all of those different kind of topics, when we say industrial cloud integration, we have divided those things up across this, what we will call 6-pack webinar series. And this first one, we are going to kind of scratch the surface of each one of those topics so you can kind of dial in which ones you want to make sure you attend or which ones you go and view the recording of. This webinar and all 6 will be recorded. They will all be made available. The slides will be available after the fact. So if you register for one and can't attend during the time zone that it's being run in, you can always go and view it after the fact. As we think about this problem and we see it through our own lens of work that we're doing in the field or work with different entities, work with organizations around the globe, we have our own view and our own perspective of the opportunities and the challenges that organizations are facing. But we also, from the SANS Institute, ask the questions of people that are within our community or familiar with SANS or doing work with us. Last year in 2023, we asked specific cloud-related questions as part of a broader survey with over 400 respondents. We saw this kind of data when we asked if you're using cloud-based services for industrial control systems or for operational technology-based systems, What are you using them for? And as you look across, you see remote monitoring, remote storage. So kind of looking at data, connections for third-party and managed services, remote processing of data and historian information, remote control from an engineering field device perspective. And then you start to move into the more process optimization and the more kind of not necessarily real time, but maybe analytics and forecasting. And you move into engineering purposes and remote control of engineering and operations in the cloud and software-based PLCs or virtual controllers. And you see kind of those numbers go down the closer you get to the actual process that is under control. And you see the numbers broad as we're talking about data in the cloud. So granted, this is from last year, so it's not that old, but this morning, I got some of the initial output from the survey for this year. So it'll be another month or two before that gets formalized and made pretty, but I wanted to share it because it is available. I could see it today. It's not as pretty, but I can tell you just looking at this data set, we asked the same questions, and there were more respondents that are doing all of these things. So increases in the number of people that are utilizing cloud for ICS and OT systems, and increases in almost every category that was surveyed. So the population size was bigger, and where they were using them has continued to grow. Again, this data will be made a little bit more beautiful, and it will be provided in our survey results for 2024. But I wanted to highlight it here that this is a growing trend globally, and it's growing in every one of the categories that we're asking. So to capture all of that information that we talked about from the big picture as you think about industrial cloud integration, and look at what we're hearing from our respondents from surveys and what we're seeing as we go out and do work in the field ourselves, there is definitely kind of these three buckets of cloud and industrial control system or OT integration. Data in the cloud, data that you care about, information about your assets, service tickets, help desk tickets that contain information about your assets, engineering data, specification information, procedures, policies. For most, that moving to the cloud and off of on-prem systems and being found in various spaces and places in the cloud environments, that is absolutely something that most on this call are already dealing with. It's already happening. So how you're protecting it and how you're securing it when it's not in your own on-prem systems is a consideration that almost all are facing. And even if you personally, your organization hasn't had to deal with that yet, there is a high likelihood that a third party, a vendor, a system integrator has data that pertains to your system, and they have it in various cloud resources and systems. So it may be your information, but you may not be the part or the reason it's in the cloud if you have kept everything internal. So the first bucket, this kind of data and cloud and various provisioning assets, when you're building an industrial control system on the licensing side and the initial provisioning and the need to connect some of those devices or components to get them provisioned in a space, that is a reality that almost everyone joining us today is facing and living with. As you move into the business optimization and the monitoring and the performance tuning and the predictive maintenance, the after the fact billing systems or the ahead of time predictive and forecasting systems, this is an area where we are seeing, and our respondents from surveys have indicated, this is where they're starting to move into cloud-based resources, and application providers, software providers are starting to move into that space as a way of doing business and insisting on having it kind of in an on-prem and architected that way, depending on who your provider is, maybe becoming less and less of an option. This third bucket to the right. So again, if you think of these as sort of bookends on a bookshelf, this third item all the way to the right, performing control from the cloud. This is usually where you will have this conversation, and if you're with a group of colleagues, you'll have some people that will immediately get a shudder and they will say, why would anyone ever do that? That's never going to happen in our environment. And then you will have others that will say, we're already doing it. And this is where the uniqueness of what type of business, what type of systems are under control, and how this is kind of architected and engineered all come into play. There's not clearly a you should be doing this or you shouldn't. There are examples of where this is being pursued for a lot of various reasons, and examples of where it's not being pursued for a number of reasons. So for example, if you are an organization that is in the nuclear sector and you're looking at control elements, highly likely you are not looking at anything moving to the cloud. If you are in renewables or storage or offshore wind at sea, or possibly even in a nation that might be currently under attack. So if you're in Ukraine and you're trying to run and operate a control center, that is a fixed target. And that fixed target, if you're counting on those on-prem systems and servers to be up for some level of supervisory control or data acquisition, that might be a difficult thing to support and manage and maintain and keep available. And as been stated in numerous public presentations, the organizations that are faced with that and dealing with that conflict today, they require the cloud for operations. So the type of environment that you are operating, the process that you are in control of, and the geopolitical situation surrounding it may move you more towards a yes than a no. So again, just kind of making sure we all understand you can't paint this picture with one brush of the industrial cloud integration element. There are a lot of different things in that picture in regards to the data for industrial control systems, the applications and the software packages, the provisioning, and then ultimately moving over into the cloud elements and understanding that there's some areas where operating and performing control from the cloud are an absolute reality that some organizations are facing, and understanding that there are other organizations that will intentionally never connect in that way. So understanding you can't paint the use side with one brush, but also going down the path of when we say cloud, that's not one thing, meaning the way people talk about cloud integration and cloud adoption, there's a variety of different examples of what this might look like, from the traditional IT side, everything on-prem, you manage it all, to looking at infrastructure as a service, where you manage some portion of it, and another portion of this is delivered as a service from a provider. Platform as a service, where you manage sort of the application stack, the software, the data sets, but the delivered as a service side is where it's running from. And then software as a service, where it is all provided to you and you are simply a user or consumer of it. So with the variations that we talk about across how we integrate into industrial control systems and process environments, then understanding the variations of what we're talking about with cloud, those are sort of two foundational elements that we can talk about as we start to have a nuanced conversation that is specific to sectors. So what does this look like from the water sector? What does it look like from natural gas and pipeline? What does it look like for rail? And as you look across each sector, there's nuanced conversations and specifics that pertain to that sector and how that sector operates. This webinar series will look to the electric sector, but much of what's being talked about can apply to other sectors. So again, if you're joining us outside of North America, if you're joining us outside of the electric sector, when we start highlighting what's going to be covered in the remaining the remaining 5 webcasts, sort of identify what makes the most sense for you in particular and plug back in on those. If you're joining us and you're from North America, bulk power and NERC CIP is a reality for you, the remaining 5 sessions will all be of interest to you. While we sort of talk about the different sectors that are here, one that I would like to call out as it helps us shape, again, what we're going to talk about and look at from the electric sector side is looking at the guidance and documentation from the water sector, specifically the AWWA document that I'd highlighted on the previous screen. They've done a really good job of going in and saying, as you, meaning the entity, the asset owner, consider industrial cloud integration, and you think about those various things that I've already commented on, and are you talking about data? Are you talking about performance and optimization and applications and software? Or are you talking about cloud, control from the cloud? as you think about those three different things, and as you think about the variations of what cloud might look like for you, whether it's infrastructure as a service, software as a service, also consider some of these unique areas for the water sector. The benefits on the maintenance and the efficiency side. You might be a small municipality or co-op that does not have any dedicated cybersecurity staff or system maintenance staff, and the on-prem assets that you have now, you're wholly reliant on contractors, vendors, system integrators, and various support agreements and funding and resources for them to do that work. There may be some benefits, if that is the case, from a maintenance and from an efficiency, from an improved system maintenance perspective, and overall a scalability and cost. There may also be things that you need to consider from a life cycle lock-in perspective. There may be some costs for dependencies and third parties and vendors. On the attack vector side, there may be new attack vectors that introduce themselves depending on how you're architected today and how you operate today. Moving to a control for the cloud example, potentially that adds new attack vectors of an undeterministic environment, unavailable communication paths, and how you architect and engineer really needs to be considered. There's a target value consideration of if thousands and thousands of utilities all move on to a cloud service provider platform, that platform becomes of much higher interest to an adversary group, for example. The most interesting thing here across the benefits, the challenges, the things that all need to be considered that are unique to your operating environment is this piece that's in the middle, is as an asset owner, as an operator, as an entity, regardless of what you do here from the operational technology side, this doesn't change who has the fiduciary responsibility of providing safe, reliable, affordable power, water, natural gas, rail service. It is still the asset owner and operator. This isn't purely a risk management strategy of how do we manage risk? Do we transfer it to the cloud service provider? Ultimately, the utility, the entity is responsible. How they choose to manage the risk that they face, whether they adopt cloud or they don't, the pluses and minuses, whether they do it for just data, they do it for performance and optimization, or they look to control from the cloud. Those are all decisions that the entity and the asset owner needs to consider and make as they move forward. So with that as sort of the level set of what we're covering across the remaining 5 webinars and what we'll be covering for the rest of the day today, we will pivot into discussions that are unique to the bulk power sector. And as we look to the existing standards and the existing NERC CIP environment, and organizations start to see we have data moving to the cloud. We're looking at software and application stacks that are moving to the cloud. As we look to renewable and storage and various different types of inverter-based resources, and we see the cloud control elements as a reality that are coming into that space, what does it mean from a regulatory, from a reliability perspective, from a security perspective? And that's really where, from a North American perspective, that is where we are now in the how do we pursue and move forward with newer technologies, innovative technologies, cloud integration, cloud adoption, and what does that look like? So for the rest of this webinar, I would like to ask Chris and Lou to come online. And I'm going to let both of these presenters introduce themselves. While we prepared for this, I did not ask who's going to go first, so I'm going to let them figure that out on their own. And I'm going to hide in the background and mute.
You stay with us for a second, Tim, because I got to give you some credit for this next slide. So,
all right, here you go.
Flip to the next slide. So I'm Chris. I work for CERC, one of the NERC regions, and I can see the eye rolls. You know, even though I can't see your pictures on screen, but you know, I know you're saying, why do you bring people to us who look like they're my grandfather who doesn't know how to install Netflix on his smart TV, right? I get that, you know, and I see where you're coming from on that. But Tim and I started working together in 1998 when we hired him as an intern from Purdue University in my company. So I remember, Tim, when you walked in and you looked in all the external offices, and if you know Tim, he's a tireless contributor. He's full of fresh ideas. And you looked around the utility in those days and said, I can't, nobody wants to listen to me. I'm too young and I'm surrounded by ancient dudes with attitudes. And well, now I look at this picture on the screen and say, sadly, Tim, it looks like I've become one. Lou as well. You know, Lou and Tim and I were colleagues together for years. Lou worked for, I believe, and Lou will introduce himself, but the trivia of the day is our very first CIP auditor, as Tim and I were building the CIP program for our company. Our very first CIP auditor who showed up was Lou Folkerth, who had moved to the dark side earlier as a CIP auditor. A few years later, I joined him as a CIP auditor in Florida at UpRCC. But today I work for CERC, which, yes, is a NERC region, but I am no longer an auditor. I work in the Assistant Outreach Program, which is a great place to be. We can develop training. We can work with our registered entities. Lou had done that for some time himself, but between Lou and I, you see those little fun graphics. Yeah, that's real stuff for us. You know, that punch paper tape. Yep, that was me many years ago in industrial control systems when I first started in this world. And electric utilities were tough to move into new technology, but I realized I started in the electric industry when Ronald Reagan had just gotten elected as president in 1981. So it's a long time. Lou, tell us about you.
Oh, very similar background. I spent 27 years at a Midwest utility and then transitioned to reliability first for the last 15 years. First 5 years of that, I was a CIP auditor. Since in the last 10 years, I've been in the outreach arm. And now I work for external affairs, where we are involved in communicating with states, entities of all kinds, and continuing my outreach on CIP to our registered entities across the NERC footprint.
So I got to say that one of the reasons we're here today doing this is because about a year and a half or 2 years ago, Lou called me and said, you know what, we've got to start looking at cloud. And I'm one of those people that Tim talked about, one of those traditional EMS engineers. If you'd have thought about putting our EMS and our SCADA in the cloud, we'd have run as fast as we could the other way. So Lou called me and said, I have an idea. What was this idea, Lou? Tell us about this group.
The Cloud Technology Advisory Group actually sprang out of a suggestion from another person who we've worked with for a long time, who's no longer in the industry. But he suggested that we start looking at the feasibility of using cloud because our utilities are being forced into usage of cloud by the service providers. If you look at things globally, the electric industry is not a huge number of companies. I believe there's about 3,000 registered in the NERC footprint total, which to a major service provider, that's a drop in the bucket for their potential customer base. So they're not looking at the needs of our industry directly. Some are, but many are not. And so our entities were being forced to use cloud services or downgrade the quality of the service they were using for security. So I stood up the CTAG, trying to model it on the version 5 transition advisory group, which was kind of an ad hoc, sort of official, sort of unofficial group. The CTAG is definitely unofficial. We are behind the scenes, but we are dedicated to making things better and more reliable. And one way of doing that is by adoption, the reasoned and careful adoption of cloud technology. Members now in the CTAG span the ERO. We have Tim from SANS. We have many from industry. We have various service providers and cloud providers as members of the group. We're looking at doing early field tests for various functions in the cloud, cooperating with the sites group and its new technology enablement group, where the new technology enablement group is working on a white paper that describes what is called as a retina process. And for the life of me, I cannot keep the meaning of that acronym in my brain. If you're interested in retina, go look up the paper and we'll figure out where it's going from there. But we're also looking at how, if and when we do move to cloud, how do we assess the implementations that have happened? That's another thrust of this group. So that's where we're coming from. Tim, did you have anything to jump in on this?
I think, let me turn my video back on. I think the main thing that I would highlight here, especially for people who are new to the industry, electric, bulk power, North America, people who are new, or for global participants that are looking at your own kind of regulations and standards across Singapore, or the NIS2 standards that are coming across the 27 member countries in Europe. This process of, hey, let's gather some people that we know are peers in this space and understand the same challenges and they're dealing with these issues, and let's gather together and try to become a force to go address this issue. That is almost a tradition across the United States, and especially in electric power, as we look to our neighbors to our left and right as a utility and all your points of interconnection, regardless of what kind of rate of return you have, investment you're making, and improvements in your system, you know that we're operating a joint synchronized system. And if your neighbor isn't doing tree trimming or generator maintenance or battery maintenance or protection relays in an appropriate way, an outage in their system can impact yours. And that's something that we've learned since the 60s, when NERC was created as a council, as a, hey, let's all come together like a neighborhood watch and try to do better for all of us under good utility practices. That was voluntary, it was joint. It's something that we have chosen to do, and almost historically and tradition has grown from that, with mutual aid after storms and damage repair, but it has morphed into cyber. So as we look at kind of the control systems and the cyber elements that are used in our safety systems at plants, and they're used in our protection systems across our transmission line circuits and our distribution automation, all of those things are how we now operate. And no different than your safety programs, and you say, hey, how do we look at root cause analysis and make sure that we're planning safety into the work? We do the same thing now from cyber and from a cybersecurity perspective. And we think about how these systems could be impacted or made unavailable or misused. And we work together as groups to deal with that from a security and operations perspective, but also when we say, when we're designing a system and when we're going to put a system in, what compliance issues exist in regards to how would we design and engineer it to ensure not only benefits for operations and for reliability, but for security as well as compliance, meaning when we go build the system, will it satisfy what the regulation requires? And that's where people like Lou and people like Chris look at the current regs and they see what systems and what vendors and what OEMs from a bigger picture are moving towards. And they say, I think we have an emerging problem that we need to start coming together, same way we have always historically and traditionally, and start talking about this, getting feedback from all perspectives, and then push that forward to try and achieve something good. When we're done with that, this group goes away. And then we all go off and work on the next thing. So to the degree that you want to be a part of that, contact Lou. To the degree that you want to engage on what you think is the next thing, there's probably other people that are dealing with that problem now, and there's no reason to wait for this one to end. So strong encouragement that this is something that is special, unique, wonderful about the electric sector and our perspective across North America. However, in my work internationally, this is just something that's special about critical infrastructure. We are all working for those organizations, but we're also customers. And we see the importance of what it means in the communities that we serve and the communities we live in. So you have a lot of mission-focused, passionate people around the globe that are working on challenges like this. All good.
I think you can go to the next slide then. Let's move on and talk about this driving forces. You know, this race car that is happening to us as we speak. You know, as we are getting calls in the region asking for a little help, you know, from our entities whose vendors are moving at the speed of light toward adopting cloud technologies. And there are lots of benefits for that. We get it. We heard about that. Tim talked about some of these driving forces a few minutes ago, but I think one of the most sobering things I've heard from one of our registered entities, that as they look down the path of compliance and reliability and security, and they see their vendors are going to go one way, but if they can't go that way because there's too much risk on the compliance side of the house, the comment we heard was they're looking at within 2 years of maybe having to have a reduced security posture to be able to accommodate staying with their systems, which are likely going to go end of life. So there are a lot of real reasons here that this race car is moving so darn fast. Lou, what else you got about that?
We're also seeing new technologies coming into play, where things like dynamic line ratings, which are getting a big play at FERC right now. Very, very interesting technology where you can change the rating of a line in response to weather conditions, wind conditions, even sunshine on the conductors can have a factor. That is all done using cloud environments. Now, right now, it is able to be done because the sensors are not in any location that is subject to the Critical Infrastructure Protection standards. But things could change, and this is a cloud-driven initiative. New technologies are coming out. If you want to try quantum computing, for example, which will have a huge impact once it reaches a critical threshold, that's being offered now as cloud services. You can go to Amazon Bracket and sample any one of 4 quantum computing providers there. That is evolving rapidly as well. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, all need cloud level infrastructure. And even within the NERC CIP standards, we're adding internal network security monitoring, for example, where most of that processing is going to require pretty substantial resources. And the service providers that we see coming into play in that area are all basing their operations in the cloud. So there's a lot of movement in that direction. Even if we wanted to resist it, we couldn't.
So I think we're going to hear from a couple of our registered entities in the next webinar, right, Lou?
Yes, the next webinar should discuss this topic and the impact on our entities and why they're moving into cloud environments in much more depth.
Okay. All right, Tim, let's go to the next slide. We're going to step aside just for a second here, just a little bit, and to make everyone aware of this white paper that was released by IEEE about 1.5 years ago. And this was an initiative with NERC and the IEEE, specifically the PES, the Power Engineering Society, the Power and Energy Society, I think that is. I'm not a member, but recognizing the need in our industry, in the electric industry, that we need to stop thinking about security after the fact, after we build something new, after we plan something new. When we get to the end of that project, we better think about fences and physical security. And do we need some network protections? What kind of devices are going to be there? So the goal of this white paper, it's about 130 pages long, and there are some really, really good chapters in this white paper. And we're hoping that we spread this through our industry because we want to get this to our planning and engineering people to understand the vulnerabilities that are out there, how fast this is moving, and how much we need to consider integrating security into the beginning processes and the engineering processes of substations and gen stations. So, and like that last bullet shows, wow, this is moving fast. So this is behind a paywall. So if you know anybody from IEEE, reach out to them. It's not expensive. It isn't, but this was a joint effort. There were regional folks, many registered entities participating in that. So a broad scope of people helped write this. It really gets into the vulnerabilities that we face as an electric utility and how we can make things more secure. Tim, you know about this?
Yeah, just to sort of keep people from chapter to chapter as we move here of what we're trying to cover in this first webinar. Again, when we talk about cloud, when we talk about industrial integration, when we talk about NERC and CIP and compliance and regs, there's no way in the world you can do that in 1 hour. So with the 25 minutes that we have left, we want to make sure you understand we are setting the tone for what is coming. And as you look to the previous slide, understand the importance of that, meaning Webinar 2 is going to be asset owners and operators who are working in this space now, and their goal is to provide safe, reliable, affordable power. You could change that last word to your sector. As an asset owner and operator, safe, reliable, affordable water or natural gas or rail service or whatever it is that you do, and hearing from peers as they talk about how they're doing it now and what they're seeing happen and what they need to consider as they start thinking about ensuring operational resilience and security and compliance and regulatory environments. Webinar 2 will be that. As Chris and Lou have highlighted here for Webinar 3, regardless of where you are in the world, your power systems and how they're engineered and how they operate, this is of interest. And what you're doing with newer innovative technologies, this paper from IEEE is of interest. If you have a means of obtaining it, that's great. Also participating in Webinar 3 and hearing about kind of the industry integration of cloud technologies would be a wonderful thing to participate in, and sort of dial into that messaging as Chris and Lou continue through for Webinar 4, for Webinar 5, and for Webinar 6. So you understand what that means to you, even if you're not North American bulk power. Again, if you're North American bulk power, this all means something to you. Back to you.
You can go to the next slide, Tim.
Yep.
And Lou's going to talk a little bit more. I mean, we were talking about the benefits. So Lou?
Well, there are quite a few benefits. There are quite a few risks, but there are quite a few benefits. One of the foremost is resilience, where you're not keeping all your systems in one area. That's been proven, as Tim mentioned earlier, that's proven particularly useful in the Ukraine, where their power control centers were actually targets of military operations. They were able to survive that by going completely cloud-based operations. And this is one case where it really did benefit them. I recommend reading that paper. It's not very, that article is not very, it's not a very long article, but it's good. One thing our utilities in this country have difficulty sometimes adapting to, especially the smaller and medium utilities, is sometimes you need to increase your computer usage for a short time. You need to run calculations on something, or maybe you've got a storm moving through and you need to work on some contingencies so you can plan your repairs. Elasticity is one of another major benefit of cloud operations. So you can rapidly adapt to your computing resources to your workload. That ties in with scalability as well. Meeting all the dynamic changes. And this is going to get more intense as we go forward with dynamic energy sources and inverter-based resources. If the cloud goes across a solar farm, that's going to drop the output of that solar farm. And you're going to need the bigger balancing authorities and reliability coordinators are going to need to be able to adjust to that in near real time. So this is getting more and more this industry is getting more and more compute intensive, not less. One of the interesting aspects of the cloud is by farming some of your functionality into the cloud, you can perhaps reduce the workload on your experienced OT, operational technology, cybersecurity staff, because some of that workload will transfer to the cloud providers. And then your experienced staff, which there is always a shortage of, can concentrate on things that are important to your organization and not on patching operating systems, for example, which is largely not an OT type considered an OT type function. The other benefits of cloud technologies are pretty well understood: measured service. One interesting one for our industry is infrastructure as code. You can have let's say a backup center ready to roll, but not have it stood up and not be charged for it until you need it, in which case you run that code, and in a few minutes, you've got a complete data center up and running with your applications all ready to go. That's potentially a huge benefit to using cloud, but that's going to be down the road a ways. So we have to work into that sort of thing. And as new technologies become available, cloud offers I think I mentioned quantum computing earlier. As things like that become available, cloud will usually offer it, and that gives you much more flexibility. We have a fourth webinar coming where the cloud service providers will discuss their benefits in much greater depth. We're hoping to get both Amazon and Microsoft, who have utility-focused groups, to present on this topic. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, next slide, Tim.
Before we dart, the only thing that I will say for those listening, that fourth webinar isn't an opportunity for the AWSs, the Azures, the Google Computes to come on and sell you cloud. This is a group members of those organizations who've been part of the CTAG effort, that have people that they are already working with throughout critical infrastructure around the globe, and specifically bulk power in North America. And they've been a part of this battle moving forward in what are the challenges, where do those challenges exist. They've been a part of the efforts to address sort of data in the cloud and what that looks like from a NERC and CIP compliance perspective. So this is a continuation of that same conversation of how do we move forward considering operational risks, cybersecurity, the benefits, the challenges, and the compliance components. Looking at the time, and if we can kind of keep an answer to 2 minutes, part of the reason that I jumped in is one question that's out there in regards to starting from the left bookend when we're talking about data in the cloud, and we're looking at NERC and CIP, or we're looking at sort of DoD requirements for protection of that data and access control of that data. This is an area where efforts like this group, will reference other groups later, but to move forward and create some implementation guidance and practice guides on how can you comply and how can you structure specific programs, and sort of as you're faced with our O365 data or our ServiceNow or our ticketing system is moving to cloud-based, how do we do this in a NERC CIP world? There are resources that are already available. So I'm going to post in a response to this question the implementation guide that's out there on BES Cyber System Information. But Lou or Chris, do you have sort of a 1 minute, 2 minute response to the importance of key management, or what you've seen as people are dealing with data in the cloud now?
Go ahead, Lou. I see you starting.
Right. The key management issue has been where the focus has been. If you are able to manage your own encryption keys and not give them away to your provider, that's the preferred method of doing things. One of the things we're looking at from the CTAG perspective is the most recent revisions to CIP 4 and CIP 11, the so-called BCSI revisions, were intended to loosen the controls a little bit and or at least make the controls more flexible to where we could put BCSI in the cloud. And what we need to do is run some field trials to make sure we can do that, where the cloud service providers might have access to the data because of their privileged position. For example, if you have a work management system, that work management system needs to be able to have access to your data or it can't do its job. And therefore, the administrators of that work management system will have access to the data. We have to figure a way to reasonably secure that information while permitting the functionality of whatever service we're using to work. So that's one of our efforts going forward with the CTAG, is to do some field trials and see where that lands us as far as compliance risk with the existing standards. There is also going forward, there's also a drafting team we'll talk about later that is being formed to address the cloud issues. And so that's the long-term issue. But if you've been in the NERC arena, it takes anywhere from usually 2 to 4 to 6 years sometimes to put new standards, to develop new standards and get them in place. We don't have that long because the vendors are moving much too quickly to permit that kind of time frame. So that's why we're doing interim processes.
And I will say that with BES cyber system information in the cloud, the standards have been changed to accommodate this. But I can tell you that the entities we talk to have some reluctance. You know, nobody wants to be the pioneer in this world yet. You know, we're really waiting for people to adopt that. So I think we have more to come on real comfort levels of having BCSI in the cloud, let alone BES operations in the cloud. Again, we'll talk about that a little more. And Tim, I think you can go to the next slide now. And this is sort of meat and potatoes here. Why can't we move now? Why aren't we doing this today? What the heck? Well, we got our vendors are ready to go. We do know of some vendors that already have SCADA in the cloud. We know that, but can we get away with that for most of our registered entities? Well, for those of you who aren't very familiar with even the NERC reliability standards as a whole, there are really two parts of the reliability standards. There's the operations and planning standards and the CIP standards, the critical infrastructure protection standards. They're pretty broad. They encompass just about everything we do in the world of security. And we'll talk, we'll give you a snapshot of that in just a moment. But the idea of the NERC reliability standards and the CIP standards in specifically, and look, I'm a fan. You know, I believe that these CIP standards have gone a long way to keeping us secure as in our control systems, control centers, in our substations, in our power plants, and you know, the early adopters, all of us in 20 years ago. This is almost 20 years we've been working on programs to be compliant with the CIP standards. They're prescriptive. There's no question about it. In most cases, CIP standards are very prescriptive. We're moving more and more to more risk-based type standards, which is a little different. And we're hoping that the direction keeps going that way. But a part of that IEEE paper we talked about earlier understands that. It recognizes the risk of cloud-based systems. And boy, if you look at that last sentence there, you know, in these types of environments, the consequences of a security vulnerability could be catastrophic. That's a fact. I mean, we saw some catastrophe last week with the CrowdStrike situation. We've all saw that on the news. Guess what? That didn't get into our control systems. That didn't affect our ability to control the bulk electric system. If it did, we could have had some catastrophe of our own. So our webinar 5, the second to the last webinar, we're going to talk a lot more about this and what the challenges are. And we're also going to, we want to make sure that you're aware of the fact that the standard changes that Lou talked about, we saw it on the very first page, way back earlier in the presentation. There has already been a standards authorization request approved to help us move to the direction we need to. So this tug of war that you see happening on the screen, we're hoping to cut that rope pretty soon. So Lou, anything to add to that?
No, just to note that the CIP standards the roots of the CIP standards go back all the way to 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And back then they were written from the perspective of a programmable electronic device. So they're really, and they were back then and pretty much still are device centric, which doesn't work in a cloud environment because you can't lay your hands on the device. And even if you do, even if you're allowed into, let's say, a Microsoft or an Amazon data center, and you're guided in and you can point to the physical server that your programs are running on. In 2 seconds, that might change, and and they might be running halfway across the country. That's one of the benefits of cloud services is you don't know, and within certain restrictions, maybe don't even care, other than legal jurisdictions, where your programs are running. That harkens back to the resilience benefit. So,
Tim, next slide. I think Lou's already talking about some of the things on the next slide anyway. So
we are.
right. So
yep.
I think we've covered most of this, and for some of you that don't know, the regions of NERC, Lou works for reliability first, I work for CERC. We are not on the compliance monitoring and enforcement side of the house. We are on the entity assessment, entity engagement, entity development sides of the house. So we're not really compliance people anymore. Yes, we're there. We live in that world, and our job is to help entities and with controls and to understand what the CIP standards, what they mean in some cases. They are mandatory. They're enforceable here, and they have been for what, Lou, 2007, 2006?
The first CIP standards became mandatory and enforceable in 2008, July of 2008. And became quote unquote auditably compliant in 2009, which is when we started audits.
So entities can face a penalty for not meeting the requirements of the CIP standards. And we recognize, and we say this all the time, they are a minimum framework. They're a minimum expectation. We always encourage and like to see entities go above and beyond, add more controls, better address cybersecurity as our attackers get better, we need to get better too. Yeah, so like Lou said, first published in 2002. That's about the time Tim and I started working on these, and that was years before they were mandatory and enforceable. And remember, it's the baseline. It's a baseline. It's a minimum framework. Tim, you've been involved with me since the beginning. Anything to add to this slide?
I think I'll add my perspective of certainly both of you would have the same perspective and same viewpoint as me from a North American perspective as utilities raced with our Y2K problem. And we started to see issues during that process of wide area system upgrades to address Y2K. And then this consideration of we're changing operational systems due to a cyber risk. And in our IT systems, we're seeing increased cyber risks of kind of SQL Slammer and Blaster and MyDoom and these various kind of worms or viruses that were moving through corporate business enterprise, and they were making their way into operational assets because of poor segmentation and poor architecture and poor kind of mixed trust models where we were trying to use technology that existed in ways that we were looking to add access control and authentication and authorization throughout control system space, leveraging existing IT infrastructure. And we saw the risk of that. So some addressed that during their Y2K efforts when they were doing system upgrades. Others, as we sort of looked post Y2K of what should we be doing as a community, power system community across North America to do something about this. And we saw this urgent action standards development request emerge. And we began working on that and creating kind of CIP before it was called CIP, the 1200 standards, the 1300 standards. And ultimately, after the wide area blackout, we started to see kind of an energy policy act and a regulatory and legislative environment move in that way. And that's sort of been what we've experienced here is as a big bad event happens, In nuclear, then you see regulation come through. In electric power, then you see regulation come through. In natural gas pipeline or liquid gas pipeline, then you see regulation and security directives come through. And now water's being talked about. As we go and look globally, you're seeing it differently because a number of the utility and critical infrastructure is government owned, government operated. So they're looking at what's necessary and required for one is required for all. So they're looking at moving forward in ways across all critical infrastructure at once, not just after an event happens responsive. They're trying to go prior to events. And so the workforce demands and the impacts on vendors and system integrators and OEMs is going to be different across the globe as we start to move all critical infrastructure at one point in time. But I would highlight here kind of the 20+ years of NERC CIP dealing with IT, dealing with OT, dealing with operations and data and physical security and all the things that CIP touches. I'm going to move you to your next slide, but all the things that CIP touches, all of these other standards development actions and legislative and regulatory environments that are being pursued around the globe, I would certainly recommend not just looking to NIST and not just looking to the IECs, but also looking to CIP as far as what controls are being used across these different environments that the vendors have to comply with. Because in many cases, regardless of sector, you're looking at a lot of commonalities in regards to vendors and protocols and architecture that 20+ years of this is working for asset owners and operators shouldn't be ignored as we're going to create new standards elsewhere in the globe. The one thing I will say, and then I'll turn it back over to you guys, when we go elsewhere in the world and start talking about NERC and CIP, there's a lot of things that emerge as that makes perfect sense. That's something that we should consider for country X, sector, whatever. The piece that always gets confusing is when they say, so who has the authority in North America to do this? And how does the governance model work? And how do you do audits? And how do you do enforcement? That's the piece where I say, we've done something super special in North America that's not going to work elsewhere, where we have nonprofit organizations that are funded by the entities who are getting audited and then the fines come. How that all works for us, I wouldn't recommend any other country pursuing that model, but the controls that you will find in NERC CIP is definitely something that I would highlight. Back to you.
I think we'll wrap this up quick. We're down to just a couple of minutes. We want to make sure that we see the path forward. Lou, you want to talk? Go to the next slide, Tim. I think we can get past this list of CIP standards. That's just to let people know how broad the standards are. But the path forward, talk about this. You mentioned the sites team a little while ago, and that's a formal team, right, Lou?
Yes, that's a formal team under the Reliability and Security Technology
Committee.
Thank you. Sites is the technology arm of basically the RSTC. They're working right now on several different papers. They have one out there that we reference here, BES Operations in the Cloud. Highly recommended reading. There is a new technology enablement group that I mentioned earlier, where we are going forward with how to implement new technologies and see if we can't possibly make our reliability standards more forward-looking than reactive. In other words, more proactive than reactive. And the drafting or the standards development project 2023-09 is being staffed as we speak. That will get started very shortly. Let's go to the next slide. And yes, webinar 6 will provide a lot more detail on this. Next slide, please, Tim. Thank you. This is a list of the webinars summary. There will be more information coming out, as I'm sure Tim will tell you. Let's go to the final slide. One more, please. There we go. Here are some resources you can use. These are all active links for when you're able to download the presentation. As mentioned earlier, the Power Engineering Society paper is behind a paywall, but I think it's only $40 even for non-members, so it's not a high bar, and it's well worth reading. So, with that, I believe we are done.
And I would like to encourage people to get involved. and honestly, that sites team, the new tech enablement team, please take a look at those sites, determine if you'd like to get involved, if you'd like to contribute, that's great. Thanks, Tim. Lauren, Sands, for hosting all this. We truly appreciate it. Tim, closing
Yes,
thoughts?
thank you.
Yep, I am going to, I know you guys did your best to get us on time complete. I'm going to be the one that makes us late. So the slide that is up currently, webinar 1 through webinar 6. Webinar 1 has just been completed. So that is our effort to cover what the next set of 5 webinars will address. In regards to the speakers and your ability to register for each webinar, we are taking an approach where they're occurring kind of every 2 weeks, so we can work our way through the remaining 5 in a timely manner. We're not looking to do these once a quarter. We're looking to work through these every other week until we complete all 5. All of those resources for all the presentations, all the speaker Q&A, those will all be captured and made available to everyone. You can register and attend them real time or view them in a recorded session. In each of the 5, I will probably kick off each one in regards to what that particular webinar is talking about. So I'll cover about 5 minutes when we start and then turn it over to the speakers that are unique to that topic. So as we look to webinar 2, again, we are looking to the people who have to live, eat, and breathe this every day. So the actual asset owners and operators, with a couple of different companies being represented in webinar 2, joining us and talking through sort of how they are seeing this opportunity and challenge and what it means for them as they move forward. As we move to webinar 3, you're going to see kind of the application provider perspective. So the software providers and the people that are putting forth solutions that you're using, and that data set or the application stack may be in the cloud. Again, as we move towards webinar 4, this is where we're going to bring forward the cloud service providers. And they're going to talk about what they're seeing and hearing from their customers in this space and what they're doing to sort of work through how do we move forward and what capabilities do we need to make sure we provide our customers so they can comply and they can start to leverage this technology in ways that is helpful, ensures reliability, ensures security, and everybody's sort of working together on this matter. As we look to webinar 5, this is really kind of a what questions are being asked. So individually, each utility may not want to come onto a public platform and say, here's what we think the biggest challenge is, and this is what we're seeing with our vendors, and if we march forward, we have compliance concerns. They may not want to be in a recorded session saying that. However, consultants and contractors and people who are going and working with hundreds of utilities that are facing these problems, they end up being an excellent aggregator and correlator to pull together that kind of perspective and say, here's where we see the greatest challenges. And here's where we think we need to focus efforts so people can move forward. And as we look to webinar 6, kind of tying this off, regardless of where we sit as an industry, we know technology and innovation and solution providers are all moving forward, whether the regulation allows it or not. And looking at various tools that NERC as the ERO and as industry regions have to sort of provide that guidance and provide that path of how people can move forward. That's really where we're looking to land this in webinar 6 with some additional regional representation. So start to finish, a lot of interesting things to plug into, whether you're North American bulk power or whether you're power elsewhere in the world or you're in any other sector. This topic of industrial cloud integration is important to many. So I would encourage you to look at the registrations, join us. And again, I'd just like to thank Lou and Chris for your time coming on here. Lou for pulling this group together and for kind of organizing everything that we're doing here. As a comment, when we post the slide deck, that PDF will have these links as clickable. If we tried to put the full URL in here, it would have been size 4 font and no one would have been able to read it. Thanks for your questions. We are going to stop presenting, but Lauren, I'm going to ask if you can leave this open just for 3 or 4 minutes so I can respond to some of the questions that are in chat. So thanks everybody. We're going to mute microphones. We're going to mute our video. but we're going to stay up for about 5 minutes while I respond to these in chat before they vanish. Thank you all.
I can help you, Tim, on the answers too.
Perfect.
We'll say. See ya.